As we continue on in the Gospel of John, we're still in chapter number 1, and we're going to pick up in verse number 12, and we're looking at today Jesus cleansing the temple. And I want to make mention of the fact that this is the first time in Jesus' ministry that he cleanses the temple. This is taking place at the very beginning of his 3 years of ministry, and this event is only told about in the Gospel of John. Now, at the end of his ministry, the three synoptic Gospels tell the events and the circumstances surrounding the second cleansing of the temple there in Jerusalem. So we begin in verse number 12 in our Bibles, and it says, after the first miracle in Cana of Galilee, he went down to Capernaum. And I say this, that the city of Capernaum is a place where Jesus spent a great deal of time, is a place where many of the miracles that he performed took place, is a place where a lot of his teaching took place in this city, as the Bible describes it as down, but if you were to look at it on a map, it would be from Cana, the journey would have been up on the map, but it's referenced to down being that it's down by the Sea of Galilee. And as they made their way there, which was about a 10, 12-mile trek, it says his traveling companions were his mother and his brethren and his disciples. And I want you to notice who these people were that were with him. Of course, his mother Mary, and then his brethren. And of course, Jesus had, we would say today, stepbrothers. They were brothers in the fact that they were children of Mary and Joseph, and of course Jesus was the Son of God. Joseph was not his, what we would say, real father, if you will, biological father, but he had no earthly father. And his brethren were traveling with them at this time, and the disciples. We don't know which disciples were traveling with the group. The 12 have not been chosen, ordained, and called out by Jesus yet as the 12 apostles, but there were some disciples, maybe more, maybe less than 12. We're not sure. And it says that they continued there not many days. In other words, they lived in Capernaum for some time. We don't, again, know the exact amount of time, how long it was. If we're talking, I would assume maybe weeks or months. And then it says that the Jews, in verse number 13, the Jews' Passover was at hand. And of course, this was the most sacred of all Jewish holidays or holy days, as they commemorate the deliverance from Israel from Egyptian bondage in the days of Moses and all the events that circled that. It was something that was very sacred in their eyes still in Jesus' day. And Jesus, of course, being a Jew, was to celebrate his desire was to celebrate this Passover in Jerusalem. So it says that they went up to Jerusalem. Again, Jerusalem is to the south on a map. In fact, it's about 80 miles away that they're going to walk through the desert to get to Jerusalem. And it's referenced as being up. Every time you see a reference to Jerusalem, we're speaking of the hill where God meets with his people. It's always reference to being up from no matter what direction you're coming, because this is a special place that God has chosen to establish the capital city, if you will, of his nation, the headquarters of the Jewish religion, the place where the temple was, the most sacred city in Jesus' day. In verse number 14, as they come to Jerusalem, of course, they make their way to the temple. And they found in the temple those that sold oxen and sheep and doves and the changers of money sitting. Now, of course, we would say, well, from the outside, you would think, well, people are coming from all over the parts of the world and they might not have the proper animals to sacrifice. So this was a matter of convenience as far as a man was concerned. Well, let's have people there that can sell oxen and sheep and doves that are ready to be sacrificed, that have gone through the proper cleansing, the proper purifying, and people can buy them for a price to make it more convenient on the worshipers and the travelers. But Jesus was very disturbed, to say the least, by what he saw. Verse number, verse number 14, or verse number 15, it says that after seeing this, he made a scourge of small cords. Now I want to mention this, that oftentimes people say, well, Jesus had an angry side. Or there's a difference between a action and a reaction. Oftentimes we do things as a reaction out of anger, and we do the wrong things. We've all been guilty of that. And yet Jesus was going to do something that on the surface looked like a reaction, but it was an action. He took some time to plan and to prepare for this. Of course, it took some time to make a scourge, a whip, out of small cords, to weave them together. And then it says he went into the temple, of course, in verse number 15. He drove them out of the temple, and the sheep and the oxen, and poured out the changers' money, and overthrew their tables. And of course, we see the violent reaction, we might say, as he poured out the money changers' table, chased the people out and chased the animals out, poured out their money, turned over their tables, and he was visibly disturbed at what was going on in the house where God desires to meet with his people. Verse number 16, and he said unto them that sold the doves, take these things hence, make not my Father's house a house of merchandise. This is the place where God chose to meet with his people, to put all the carnal things aside. This is to be a very sacred time, a very sacred place, and yet you've made it something that you can profit from. The three synoptic gospels, when they speak of the second cleansing of the temple, they make the statement that they quote Jesus as saying, my house is to be a house of prayer, but ye have made it a den of thieves. You're here to make worship convenient. You're here to make a profit out of what ought to be a sacred time of worship, God meeting with his people. The book of 2 Peter speaks of this, and I think it can be applied to what's happened in Christianity over the years, that many people think, well, we can make some money on the side by doing the work of God. And 2 Peter chapter number 2 talks about these false these false teachers that creep in into Christianity as they did in the Jewish days. In verse number 2 and 3 of 2 Peter 2, it says, and many shall follow their pernicious ways. They'll convince many to follow after them, by reason of whom the way of truth shall be evil spoken of. And how sad it is that many times the world, sometimes justly so, has reason to condemn God's people for the way they conduct themselves. The way of truth shall be evil spoken of. And Peter goes on to say, and through covetousness shall they with feigned words make merchandise of you, whose judgment now of a long time lingereth not, and their damnation slumbereth. God's going to take care of those that are literally making a profit in the ministry or serving God's people. Now, verse number 17, of course, after the events, after the dust had settled, so to speak, it says, and his disciples remembered that was written. And they're quoting here from the Old Testament. We're going to look at that verse in just a minute. But their quotation literally is take these things. I'm looking at the wrong verse. I got to get the right verse here. It says, the zeal of thine house hath eaten me up. Now that's how they quote the verse. I want to go back and mention the entire verse. The verse that they're quoting is Psalm chapter number 69, verses 8 and 9. And the verse says, I am become a stranger unto my brethren, and an alien unto my mother's children. For the zeal of thine house hath eaten me up, and the reproaches of them that reproach thee are fallen upon me. It's up to me to do something about it. I see in that verse the intense desire that God has for His house, His temple, to be a place of praise and worship to Him. He's consumed by that zeal. And that zeal is misunderstood by those around him. And Psalm 69 makes mention of my brethren. I become an alien. I'm a foreigner to them. They don't understand the zeal that I have for a right relationship in the house of God. Now put that into context of today, that our body is the temple of God. God has a desire that we would glorify Him by our life, by our actions, by our words, by our witness. And God is so desirous to use us that sometimes we misunderstand when He brings things in our life to conform us to His image. We may not completely understand it. And maybe a good way for us to pray today as we consider not the temple as a building, but our temple as the temple of our body as His temple. To pray constantly, Lord, cleanse my temple of my carnal nature, to make my service and worship to You of a carnal nature, of a convenient nature. Lord, cleanse this temple of my carnal desires so that I would be pleasing to You, because You're zealous to live through me and fellowship with me and commune with me on a regular basis, and I don't want anything to stand in the way of my worship and desire for You.